Thank you for joining us today as we mark 4 years since the shooting on October 27, 2018 at the Tree of Life Synagogue that took 11 loved and committed community members. As we remember them on this day, we know that we all help to ensure that their memories are forever a blessing by carrying forward acts of service, study of Torah, and commitment to our communities. So thank you for being with us today to do that. As I said before, my name's Emery Malachowski. I'm the outreach coordinator of the 1027 Healing Partnership. But today we're blessed to be joined by Judy Klitsner. And in a second, I'll let Shira Berkovitz introduce them and give a little bit of more information about them. General housekeeping rules are that you keep yourself on mute unless engaging with the speaker. If you're calling in from a phone number, please put your video on just so we can see who's joining us. In addition, if there are any members of the press joining us, welcome, but please note that this session is off the record. Finally, please know that we do record this talk for the 1027 Healing Partnership. I will now pass this introduction on to Shira. Shira, are you able to unmute yourself?
Hi, everybody. It's a great honor to be able to introduce Judy Klitsner. Judy is a senior educator at the Pardes Institute of Jewish Studies in Jerusalem. A disciple of the great Torah scholar Nechama Leibowitz, Judy has brought her empowering text-based
I'm sorry, Shira, you were very temporarily muted. Could you unmute yourself again? That was my fault. Thank you.
Throughout the years, she has taught lay people, leaders, and rabbis across the denominational spectrum, as well as groups of Christian and Muslim students of the Bible. Judy is the author of the groundbreaking book, Subversive Sequels in the Bible, How Biblical Stories Mine and Undermine Each Other, now in its 4th printing, which won a National Jewish Book Award. She is also founding board chair of Sacred Spaces, an organization that seeks to address abuses of power in Jewish institutions. And in this role, I am really privileged to call Judy dear colleague, mentor, and also friend. And she is the founding board chair because of her incredible and unparalleled leadership on this issue in the Jewish community. Judy is currently working on a pilot for an original online commentary to the Bible, and she is a dear friend in Pittsburgh by many of you who know her. It's my honor to introduce Judy, and I will just say that every time I get to attend a Torah lesson with Judy, I always leave thinking, I can do this Torah, I can learn this Torah, and where was Judy when I was in school? So with that, Judy, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Shira. I'm gonna need a soothing nod from people too. Are you hearing me? Are we good? Excellent. Hi. Thank you so much, Shira. And I want to thank all the good people of Pittsburgh, Maggie, Emery. Thank you for inviting me to address you here, to learn with you today. I feel a very warm connection with the community of Pittsburgh. We go back a long way. I started teaching in Pittsburgh over 20 years ago, and I see several of you from those days, and it's really great to see you here as well. And since then, it's been wonderful that my colleague Shira Berkovitz relocated to Pittsburgh, and so I have that connection. And even most recently, my son and daughter-in-law and 4 beautiful grandchildren are living among you. So thank you for taking them in. And now let's get down to work. My mandate is to learn with you, to teach for the next 45 minutes or so, and that's going to require a lot of talking. And I have to apologize in advance that this is not going to be nearly as interactive as I would love to do. Next time when I'm there in person, I'll show you how it's supposed to be done, but we'll do our best with the medium. But the irony in all this talking is that in truth, solemn occasions such as this one would be better served with silence. And in fact, okay, here we go. Move. There we go. In our tradition, in Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Fathers, we have this statement. Rabbi Akiva tells us that's backwards. Silence is a fence to wisdom. And such a fence is especially needed, I would say, when responding to overwhelming tragedy, such as that which happened 4 years ago in your community. And what often happens is that very well-meaning but somewhat misguided people feel the need to find and often verbalize philosophical, sometimes pat philosophical formulas that will help explain the cruel injustices of humanity and of God. But as we're about to see, and I hope in this session that we have together, the Torah itself steers its readers away from such formulas. And in fact, in quite remarkable ways, the Torah addresses the big questions about God's running of the world through a pair of stories. And both of these stories are going to use what I like to look at as a kind of artful silence as a very powerful tool that it uses to deliver a decidedly non-pat, actually quite complex set of messages. The first story that we're going to look at is the binding of Isaac. The Hebrew term for that is the Akedah, which is a tragic story. It's a confounding story. It's about the near death of an innocent child delivered by a father, Abraham, all at the behest of God. And before we dig into the text, allow me just another word about silences. We use them all the time. In fact, we use them so often, we hardly even notice them, right? We say things like, not another word, just a second. And of course, what the listener understands is the listener fills in the gaps. Do not utter another word. I'll be with you in just a second, right? So why do we skip those words? Why don't we say the entire sentence? Well, we don't have to, right? The missing words are obvious to both the speaker and the listener. And what we gain by leaving those words out is a sense of speeding things up, and it brings with it a sense of urgency. And in literature, of course, these shortcuts are used all the time. The fancy literary term for these silences is ellipses. And we find them so often that we barely notice them. For instance, in this very well-known elliptical statement by Richard III, a horse, my kingdom for a horse, right? Obviously what he means is, I need a horse desperately. I will give my kingdom for a horse. But again, these missing words would only hold us back and take away from the drama. So in one sense, silences help speed us up, but then there's the second opposite function to literary silences. Sometimes they actually slow us down and they get us to pay more attention, not less attention, to the missing parts. Okay, those of you from my generation are going to recognize this scene from a movie called The Graduate. And this is a story of a young man who's suddenly thrust into the world after his graduation. And there are all these expectations and pressure from society around him. He's confused, he feels alienated. And all of that is expressed powerfully through this very long, silent moment. And there he is, Dustin Hoffman, at the bottom of his parents' swimming pool with all the swimming gear that his parents bought him as a graduation present that they wanted him to show off to their middle-aged suburban guests. And this silence conveys this young man's intense loneliness so much more powerfully than a few extra lines of dialogue ever could have. And so much so, this wordless moment was so powerful that it's still being taught 50 years later in film schools. So with this as background regarding silences, they can speed us up, they can slow us down. I think we're now ready to approach our very difficult story, the Akedah. To my mind, it is probably the most difficult story in all of the Bible. And full disclosure, please don't expect me to crack this story within the next 40 minutes or so, but I do hope that we'll be able to gain some insight based on the story's artful silences. So I invite you now to come to dive into the story with me, and I want to go from back to front. We're going to start near the story's end with this silence. Okay, and actually before we do this, I just want to give you, for those of you who need a refresher, a quick outline of the story is that God commands Abraham to sacrifice his beloved son, Isaac, and Abraham is going to comply wordlessly with a series of actions, and we'll see later what those actions are, and he sets off on a 3-day journey. Once he arrives at this mountain, Abraham raises the flesh-eating knife to slaughter his son, but suddenly God's angel calls out from the heavens, canceling the decree, and then commends Abraham for his God-fearing, which means his willingness to sacrifice his son. Okay, so immediately after all that, we get this verse. The Hebrew, Vayashov Avraham el Ne'arav, Abraham returned to his lads. And of course, everybody wants to know, right? The huge gap here is what happened to Isaac, right? Isaac wasn't slaughtered. Where is he? Why is only Abraham coming back? So again, as we've seen, the silences can speed us up or they can slow us down. And here first is Radak. This is David Kimchi in the 12th century in France. And his response is, well, this silence, like so many others, is meant to speed things up. There is no need to say that Isaac was with him. The text mentions Abraham only because he's the primary subject. Why doesn't it mention Isaac? Because it's obvious that he was with Abraham. So the text just wants to convey this information as quickly as possible. Okay. But alternatively, we have this, Chizkuni in the 13th century in France, and he, of course, brings the opposite. No, that silence is there to slow us down, to help us, to get us to consider a new angle on the story, to ask ourselves, why isn't Yitzchak there? Well, he's not there because he's not mentioned because he isn't there. But then, of course, we want to know, where did he go? And so here is Chizkuni suggesting, in line with the Midrash, where did he go? He went to the study house of Eber to learn Torah. Of course, where would any good Jewish boy go? He goes to yeshiva. And maybe what he means by this interesting comment, the hint here is that here is Isaac, who was almost offered up as a burnt offering to God. And what this statement is hinting at is perhaps that in some sense, he never really rejoins the material world. In some sense, he does not come back from that mountain because he's never going to live a normal life ever again. He's going to spend his life engaged in or engrossed in holy texts. Is this a kind of post-trauma that he's experiencing? I don't know, but here is in this artist's rendering of the blind Isaac later in his life, blessing Jacob. Remember the two sons, Jacob and Esau. Jacob is dressed up as his brother. And here is Rebecca, the wife, standing off, kind of the architect of everything, looking on. And this, I think, supports the view that Isaac, after the Akedah, after the traumatic events of that near sacrifice, in some real sense, never comes back to humanity, never fully returns, to such an extent that he really doesn't have a clue which son he should be blessing. His wife doesn't feel that she can speak directly to him to help him understand. There's this kind of disconnect between him and the world. Here's another suggestion, a little more radical response. This is from the 18th century, the Yalkut Reuveni. And in this conjecture, where is Isaac? He's missing. Oh, he must have been in the Garden of Eden. And here, I think this is a gentle way of saying that Isaac is not present. He's in the Garden of Eden. It's a gentle way of saying that he's passed from this world. In essence, what has happened to Isaac is that he was actually slaughtered on that mountain. And this reading, although it isn't exactly true to the plain sense of the text that says he wasn't slaughtered, it had great resonance historically. I would imagine that it has resonance in this gathering here today, because throughout Jewish history, especially in times and in places where terrible anti-Semitism was prevalent, Abraham's children, right, Abraham's descendants were killed because of their relationship with God. And for those innocents, there was no miraculous last-minute reprieve. So even though this reading doesn't seem true to the plain sense of the text, it was considered to be much truer to actual events in Jewish history. And what I want to say is it's not really our task here to definitively fill in that gap of Isaac's absence. We will never know definitively where he was and why the text skips over him. But I think it is our task to note the power of that gap. The gap has the ability, the silence, to draw us in, to spark our imaginations, to open us up to all kinds of possibilities, maybe even to get us to consider the possibility of reading the text on multiple levels, that the Akedah might be communicating several things at once, right? Maybe at the same time, it's a story about a test of faith. It's a psychological study of post-trauma. Maybe it's an emotionally rendered foreshadowing of the darkest moments in Jewish history. This kind of opening up, broadening, and deepening of possibilities is one of the primary functions of the Bible's art for silence, of the Bible's artful silences. And now to get to the main point, let's move on to the two greatest silences in the story. The silences that for millennia have made this story so hard to decipher and so deeply disturbing. The first, and I think the most pressing, is simply this one. God turns to Abraham and says, take your son, your only one, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I will point out to you. Okay, simply put, how could this be? How could God have issued such a horrific order to begin with, even if it's called off at the last moment? The narrative, it contains no explanation, no justification, no apology for a command that flies in the face of, first of all, of biblical theology, right? God is the God of the Torah is against human sacrifice. This just goes against it. It flies in the face of God's system of ethics. God, and here in the book of Genesis, when God reveals why Abraham was chosen to be God's servant, the Lord said, I have singled him out, Abraham, so that he will instruct his children and his posterity to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is just and right. And here's the Hebrew, tzedakah umishpat. That is the primary purpose of Abraham's calling, to be a purveyor of justice and righteousness, tzedakah umishpat, in the world. And here is God appearing to the same Abraham and ordering him to perpetuate and perpetrate an act that represents the polar opposite of tzedakah or mishpat, the slaughter of an innocent child. Okay, so it flies in the face of ethics, it flies in the face of theology, and in addition, it flies in the face of God's trustworthiness. It negates God's repeated promises to Abraham of progeny, of a future nation. All of this was going to be at the core of his mission. And here's a scene where God tells him to count the stars. That's how great your descendants are going to be. Starting at Lech Lecha, where God first calls on Abraham, and repeatedly throughout his story, God continually makes these promises to Abraham. Yet here is God saying, you have this one son, he is your heir. Now I want you to slaughter him. Okay, so for all these reasons, I would say, first of all, this is the biggest silence in the story, God's inscrutable command. But there's a second silence that is almost as troubling, and that's this, which is Abraham's lack of response, no reaction, right? What does he do instead? After God says, take your son, your only son, and bring him up as a burnt offering, here's Avram's response. Not a single word is spoken. Instead, Vayashkem Avraham baboker. Look at the underlined words here, both in Hebrew and in English. There's this string of actions, almost a sense of frenetic activity. He arose early in the morning, he saddled his donkey, he took his lads, he split the wood, he got up, he went. But you get the sense that he's just moving and moving and moving to avoid verbal response to anything that God has said. And I would say that getting back to Sodom, Abraham in this situation of Sodom, the evil cities of Sodom, how do we say that? In Sodom and Gomorrah, this silence stands out because that story, he was a man of a great many words. And if we could just return to Sodom for a moment, after God reveals the reason for choosing Abraham, he is going to be my purveyor of justice and righteousness, tzedakah umishpat. Here, and then God says, I'm going to kill these people in Sodom because they're evil, and they are in fact evil. Abraham launches into this impassioned plea to spare the people of Sodom, even though he knows that they are undeniably evil. And in this really impressive effort, look how Abraham turns God's own words against God. Basically, what Abraham says, by repeating these words, tzaddik, tzaddik, shofet, right, echoing tzedek, mishpat, basically what Abraham says takes God's own language and says, you want me to be your representative of tzedakah umishpat? Where, God, is your tzedakah umishpat? Why don't you practice what you preach? Why don't you show us, lead the way in being just and in being right? And remarkably, after Abraham launches this plea, repeatedly, God backs down. Eventually, Abraham loses the battle, right? There aren't even 10 people in the city to spare the whole city. But God's very backing down is a kind of tacit sanctioning of Abraham's very brazen verbal efforts. And I would say that making his silence at the Akedah all the more perplexing is that he has a much stronger case there, right? As opposed to the evil people of Sodom, Isaac is guilty of nothing. And as opposed to the anonymous people of this evil city, Isaac is Abraham's own flesh and blood. You would think we would expect him, if he's going to launch an impassioned plea, it should start with his own offspring, yet he is completely silent. So to begin addressing these two greatest gaps in the Akedah story, the silence of God and the silence of Abraham, we need to look at yet another silence in the story. This is a relatively small one. Bear with me here, there's lots of silences. Okay, when Abraham first starts moving, God says, go up to this mountain and slaughter your son. We're told he does all that whole list of activities. And then, Bayom HaShalishi, on the third day, Vayisa Avraham et Einav, he raises his eyes and he sees the place from afar. And of course, the gap here, the silence is, what happens on days 1 and 2? What do you mean on the third day? We heard nothing about Abraham's actions or thoughts or words during those 2 days. And so again, we have our two different opinions, our two different schools of thought. Benno Jacob in the early 20th century in Germany says, he makes the familiar argument, 3 days, right, speed us up. 3 days are often the period of time for the preparation of important events. Why skip what happens? Because it doesn't matter, they're just getting themselves ready. But alternatively, we have this. David Zvi Hoffman in the 19th, early 20th century, also in Germany, says 3 days were given to Abraham to deliberate within himself. He engages in a stubborn, heroic struggle. And the Midrash Tanchuma expands on this struggle, giving us the details of what is that struggle? What are the words that were forming inside of Abraham, yet were never spoken? And here the Midrash is going to use Satan, dressed as an old man, as a kind of literary device. It's going to plant in Satan's mouth all the arguments, all the objections that are brewing inside of Abraham's mind. But these are arguments that he never allows himself to express. Okay, and what are these arguments? Argument number 1 on the screen here, the first one, the Satan accosted him and appeared to him in the guise of an old man. He asked him, where are you going? And Abraham said, to pray. And so Satan, dressed as an old man, says, well, why would one who's going to pray have fire and a knife in his hand and wood on his shoulder? Okay, that's argument number 1. Scenario number 2, Satan said to him, to Abraham, why would an old man like you kill a son who was born to him at the age of 100? Second statement of challenge of Satan. And the third challenge, he said, tomorrow they will say to you, murderer, you have spilled his blood. Okay, what's going on here? What it seems is happening here is that the first argument, if you're going to pray, why do you have that knife? Basically, this is a ritual argument, right? Abraham, the objection that's burning within him, why would someone who's going to serve God require instruments of murder? Basically, what's happening here is inwardly, Abraham is questioning God's command, wondering how can killing my son possibly be construed as a display of serving God? This is not the religion that God has taught me. What's going on here? Argument 2, why would an old man like you kill a son born to him at the age of 100? This seems to be an emotional argument that he's making. Right? You've yearned all your life for this child, and now God in one inexplicable moment says, go kill him, right? What is he screaming inside of himself? How could God be so cruel? How could God play with my emotions, make all these promises, finally give me this miracle child, then just to take him away from me? What kind of God is this? And argument number 3, murderer. Right? What kind of argument is that? That's a philosophical moral argument, right? People are going to call you a murderer. Of course, the Akedah is the antithesis of this entire system of ethics that God has taught Abraham. God is now telling him to do the exact opposite of everything that he's been taught. Okay, so in the Midrashic mindset, all of these doubts are coursing through Abraham's mind and his soul in those silent 3 days. And we, the careful readers, are meant to step into that silence, right? There's a hint. The third day, what happened in those first two days? It must have been that Abraham was thinking all of this, but never, ever expressing it. Okay, and I think with this kind of argument, what the Midrash is doing is drawing a line between Abraham at the Akedah and Abraham in Sodom. He's still the impassioned challenger of God, questioner. How does God run the world? How could there be injustice? But of course, the big difference between Abraham in Sodom and Abraham at the Akedah is that this time, Abraham, the outspoken critic, keeps his questions and doubts buried deep inside of him. They are never to be spoken, never to be heard. Okay, but all of this just brings us back to the question of why. Why does he not protest? We know he's able to. We've seen him do it. Why does he respond to the horrific command of God with only actions and no words? And here I want to move for some extra insight on this to a man named Eric Auerbach, who wrote a piece called Mimesis. He's a 20th century literary critic who compares the style of Homer to the Bible. And here, like the Midrash, Auerbach is going to see those 3 days as a literary device that are meant to encourage us, the reader, to imagine Abraham's inner turmoil. But unlike the Midrash, he addresses the larger question of why it is that Abraham stays silent. Why does he think it but not say it? And in his view, those 3 days are actually not, as the Midrash claims, filled with all kinds of questions and challenges that are bursting out from it or imploding within him. But rather, these 3 days are mentioned in order to highlight the very absence of any kind of coherent, rational thought, any kind of moral challenge. These 3 days, in his view, are about a kind of raw, primal emotion, none of which could be expressed or even formulated in words, even internally in Abraham. Right? In his view, in Auerbach's view, the silence of the 3 days, look how he puts it. It's as if while he traveled on, Abraham would look neither to the right nor the left, right? Any sign of life, save only their footfalls. The journey is like a holding of the breath, a blank duration, a kind of complete humble surrender to forces beyond his comprehension, beyond his control. So in sharp contrast with his behavior in Sodom, this time he's arguing that even those words, Abraham's words, even the words that are inside of him, might have been inside of him, will be of no use. All we hear and all there is this kind of repetitive sound of Abraham's footfalls on the sand, symbolizing his complete submissiveness that replaces the masterful orator of Sodom. Okay. You might remember at the outset, I promised you 2 stories, 2 difficult stories that address the big questions of God's running of the world. And I think we're ready now to consider the second. And that second story is the book of Job, which I believe engages in a kind of vibrant, sometimes even subversive dialogue with the stories of Abraham, both in Sodom and at the Akedah. Okay, so let's start with this. We won't have time to go into the book of Job in depth, but I just want to point out these really remarkable similarities. Both stories center on a leading figure who is described as Yireh Elohim. This is a very rare term that's used. They're both God-fearing. In addition to that, both stories, right, the faithful servant of God, God is going to test the faithful servant through a direct threat to that servant's offspring. In addition to those really basic similarities, we have the names of places and people that are shared in both stories, rare names like Utz and Buz and Kesed. Abraham and Job are the only two biblical characters who refer to themselves as afar va'efer, meaning dust and ashes. So these are some, I think these, it's pretty compelling, these connections. It really makes the case that these two stories belong in some kind of a dialogue between them. But as we dig in more fully, we note that the parallel with Abraham at the Akedah is going to break down in three significant ways. First of all, in the story of the Akedah, there's one child who's under threat of being killed by God. And in the book of Job, it's all 10 of his children. In the story of the Akedah, there's a last minute reprieve, right? Isaac is not killed, whereas in the story of Job, there is no reprieve and all 10 children actually die. And I think perhaps most significantly, the biggest difference between these stories is that unlike Abraham, the silent, stalwart servant of God, submissive servant of God in the story of the Akedah, here the hero's mouth is unleashed. And he's going to just let out a torrent of words, making every argument that Abraham could have made, but chose not to. Okay, so it turns out that in addition to the initial similarities between Job and Abraham of the Akedah, Job ends up resembling Abraham in Sodom, right? This combative Abraham who boldly challenges God. And here I'd like to suggest that with its similarities to Abraham, both in Sodom and at the Akedah, this ingenious book of Job manages to uphold both of these models. And this duality is reinforced by what I like to think of as the book's kind of postmodern, I know it's a big word, ending. It's got a non-linear structure. It has two different endings. This is a book with two endings. And remarkably, these two endings are going to contradict each other. Okay, bear with me here. Let's start with ending number one. After Job has struggled and argued with God and made really brazen arguments against the way that God brings injustice into the world, here is God saying to Job, finally appearing to Job from a storm. We've got this kind of sound effects, sight sound show going on here. And the Lord answered Job from the storm and said, "Who is that who darkens counsel, speaking without knowledge? Have you ever commanded the day to break, assigned the dawn its place?" Okay, so fighting words, right? Basically, what is God saying to Job? You've got complaints about the way I run the world. When you can create a mountain, when you can create the daybreak, come see me. But until that time, you would do very well to keep silent. Keep your complaints to yourself. You can't begin to fathom my power or my motives. Or to put it a little more crudely, what is God saying here? I am God, you are not. So stand back in respectful, submissive silence. Okay, and I think that while this is very frustrating to the reader, this ending does present an answer of sorts to the Akedah's greatest puzzle, to its greatest silence. And I think it's consistent with the overall tenor and message of the Akedah, which is, you human being are so insignificant, you can't begin to fathom God. So it's best to just stay still and remain a silent, submissive servant. And that's what we see with Abraham at the Akedah. But curiously, the book of Job has got a second, essentially opposite ending, in which God is going to uphold Job's right to voice his objections at the way that God runs the world. And in this kind of shocking development, here is Job, God's most relentless critic. God is going to vindicate Job. The Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, I am incensed at you and your two friends. Okay, there are these friends of Job who've been defending God throughout the book, saying there's no such thing as bad things happening to good people. And Job is arguing, yes, there is. I'm a good person and terrible things have happened to me. And here is God at the end of the book saying, Job is right, you are wrong, and you, friends, my apologists, have to go now and apologize to him. So this ending, I would say, is remarkably consistent with Abraham and Sodom, right? This is as far as we could possibly get from the silent Abraham of Sodom. And I think that with this paradoxical double ending, this amazing book, what it does, what it sacrifices in linear logic, right? We've got two seemingly two irreconcilable endings. But what we get instead in its place, the gain here, the payoff, is this complex worldview that embraces both bold argument at God's injustice and silent submission to it. We've got both, and both are upheld. Okay, what might all this have to say about today's world and the unfathomable evil that continues to afflict the innocent? And I would like to suggest that both modes are relevant to the ways in which we naturally respond to tragic injustice. Often like Abraham and Sodom, and like Job in ending number 2, we respond to tragedy by taking full control. We use our deeds, we use our words, we do everything we can to make our world feel more manageable, more understandable. And I understand, if we could just jump to the present occasion, I understand that here in Pittsburgh, there are wonderful year-long efforts to promote self-protection, self-defense of all kinds of Jewish institutions. There are beautiful efforts to educate toward peace, toward tolerance, to build relationships within the community and in surrounding communities. Efforts of all kinds at tikkun, for fixing all that's broken in society, trying to make our world a safer place, a saner place. These are things that are done here in the community and in many other places year round. But there's another mode of response, which I think is equally relevant. And I think it's suggested by these texts that we've looked at, that has its place at particular moments in life. And that is the wordless, humble submission to God's overwhelming might. In this mode, our thoughts, our plans fall short, our words fall short. We're left only with those silent, as Auerbach said, those silent footfalls of the Akedah, with a holding of the breath. And I think in this mode, we just kind of stand silent, holding that pain that lies within us. And that second mode of response, I always think of this famous painting by the Norwegian artist Edvard Munch, the painting called The Scream. And for more than a century, this painting has struck a deep chord with its viewers. There's something intensely recognizable in that face that's been distorted by existential pain, that seems to express feelings that are so intense they could never possibly be contained in words. And for me, living here, I have the privilege of living in Israel. For me, the equivalent of that scream, that silent scream, is our annual marking of Yom HaZikaron, of Memorial Day, where the nation draws together to mourn its many sacrificed children, whether it's through war, through terror. Once a year, we just lean into our pain as this 2-minute siren wails and the country comes to a silent halt. And to me, those 2 minutes feel like nothing less than a collective silent scream. And of course, that silence compares starkly with the way that we function the rest of the year here in Israel, where an entire country of experts, so-called experts, we engage in a kind of incessant verbiage, right? With impassioned debates, we're always yelling at each other. Basically, we're all Abraham and Sodom, making all of our arguments, ethical arguments, strategic arguments, practical arguments. We know it all, and everybody knows better than everybody else. But on that one day, and for those 2 minutes in our communal Akedah moment, I think we just suspend the analysis, we suspend the arguments, we just stand there silently with our memories and with our pain. For just that moment, we stop thinking about how we might control the situation, and instead we just linger with it. And it seems to me that here on this solemn day, October 27th, here in Pittsburgh, this is an Akedah moment. Right, and here I would say on this day, the people in Pittsburgh, and along with so many others, both in the Jewish community and far beyond it, take a moment to emit that collective silent scream. And that scream is for all those innocent sons and daughters senselessly ripped from their families, from the community, those blameless victims of blind hatred, of ignorance, of evil. And I think on a day like this, we're at a loss as to the big questions, the whys, the hows. On this day, our words, our deeds kind of take a back seat to that silent scream that just wells up within us. And I want to leave you with the thought and the prayer, Yehi Ratzon. May our profound silence pierce the heavens. May it be God's will may God be moved to the point that our sacrifices, those unbearable akidot that we have all suffered, may they be the last that we will ever have to endure. And may the memory of those beloved 11 souls that we have lost forever be a blessing. Yehi Zichram Baruch.
As our time of study comes to end, we're going to take part in the time-honored tradition of reciting Kaddish D'Rabbanan. The Kaddish is an ancient prayer written in Aramaic, a sister language of Hebrew, which was the spoken. Sorry, that just interfered with my notes. Oh, here we go. It's okay. I got it. The Kaddish is an ancient prayer written in Aramaic, a sister language of Hebrew, which was the spoken language of the Jewish people during the period of the Second Temple and thereafter. The title stems from the second word of the recitation, V'it Kaddish, may it, God's great name, be sanctified. Reciting the Kaddish is considered an act of Kiddush Hashem, sanctifying the name of God. The honor of reciting this Kaddish has been assigned to mourners. The Kaddish D'Rabbanan, recited after the study of rabbinic text, is an expanded version of the regular full Kaddish. It contains a special prayer for the well-being of the rabbis, their disciples, and all who study Torah. Throughout the centuries, the teachers of Torah have played a central role in preserving and expanding the teachings of Judaism and in providing leadership and guidance for Jewish communities throughout the world. This prayer calls our attention to their importance and prays for God's blessing upon them and upon all who occupy themselves with Torah. Please join with Marty Gaynor, if you wish, in praising God as the source of life and learning, even in the shadow of death. You're welcome to recite the entire Kaddish or just the responses as you wish, but please do so on mute. And please rise if you are able. Having concluded our study for now, we raise up the names and memories of Joyce Feinberg, Edith Baltcha, Bat Abba Menachem, Richard Gottfried, Yosef Ben Chaim, Rose Mallinger, Razel Bat Abram, Jerry Rabinowitz, Yehuda Ben Yechaskel Veselma, Cecile Rosenthal, Sissel Chaim Ben Eliezer, David Rosenthal, David Ben Eliezer, Bernice Simon, Bela Rachel Bat Moshe, Sylvan Simon, Zalman Shachna Ben Menachem Mendel, Daniel Stein, Daniel Abram Ben Baruch, Melvin Wax, Moshe Gadol Ben Yosef, and Irving Younger, Yitzchak Chaim Ben Menachem, Zichronam Livracha. May their memories be a blessing.
Amen, amen. Thank you, Shira, and thank you, Judy, so much for being with us and giving over this wonderful learning. And of course, Kaddish D'Rabbanan comes in the Siddur, really just a short distance after the Akedah, which we confront every single morning in the Siddur. And you've given us some insights and some ability to better wrestle with that and extract meaning from that as we go forward. Kaddish D'Rabbanan. Yisgadal v'yisgadal shmei rabah. V'amad divrach Yerusei v'yamlich malchusei v'chaye chayin v'yamei chayin v'chaye d'chol beis Yisrael v'agalav v'izman kuri v'imru umin. Yehei shmei rabah mavorach l'am l'mei almaya. Yisbarach v'yishtabach v'yispa'ar v'yisramam v'yisnaseh. V'yisadar v'yisalev v'yisalal shmei d'kudasha brichu. Leila min kol birchosa v'shirasoh, tush b'chosa v'nechumosa, ga'amiram v'alma v'imru umin. Al Yisroel, V'al Rabbanan, V'al Talmidei Hain, V'al Kol Talmidei Salmidei Hain, V'al Kol Mun Daskin Bar Raisa, Di B'Yasra Hadain V'di B'Chol Asar V'Yasar, Yehei Lahain Lachain Shlama Rabba, China V'Chista V'Chai Arichei Amazani V'Vichei, Ufur Kona Min Kadam Avu Hain Dishmaya V'Imru Umein. Yehei Shlama Rabba Min Shmaya, V'Chaim Tevim Aleni V'Al Kol Yisroel V'Imru Umein. Oise Shalom B'Ramav, Hu Yaseh V'Rachamav Shalom, Aleni V'Al Kol Yisroel V'Imru Umein.
Thank you all for joining us today. I hope to see you in the 1 p.m. Torah study. You all are getting out with enough time to grab a drink of water. Otherwise, if you'd like to join us for our commemorative ceremony today, it is in Shenley Park at 4 p.m. May peace be with you.